Chapter 1. The Quiet Before the Storm. Marleycombe in late summer was the kind of place that postcards pretended England always looked like. Rose-clad cottages lined the high street, their gardens spilling over with foxgloves and hollyhocks. The church spire stood in quiet dignity above the elm trees, and the village green, with its neat bandstand, seemed always prepared for some cheerful fete or cricket match. To the casual visitor, life here might appear charmed, untouched by the darker tides of the wider world. But villagers knew better. Beneath Marleycombe's serenity lay a constant murmur of gossip, speculation, and small rivalries. That was the English way, after all. Troubles disguised with politeness, feuds smoothed over with tea, and secrets kept beneath tidy front gardens. It was on such a morning, warm, still, with the faintest hum of bees in the hedgerows, that something occurred which would alter Marleycombe forever. The Women's Institute had organized a charity rummage sale in the parish hall. Old clothes, chipped china, second-hand books, and odds and ends had been gathered from every household. By 10 o'clock, the hall was filled with eager browsers, bargaining over teapots and hats with a seriousness that would not have been out of place in a London stock exchange. Miss Jane Marple, a slight figure in a dove-grey coat, her white hair neatly pinned beneath a straw hat, moved gently between the stalls. She had donated a stack of household linens herself and was now examining a table of books with mild interest. Though her manner was unobtrusive, her eyes missed very little: the quarrel between Mrs. Larch and her daughter-in-law over a quilt, the nervous way Mr. Edgar Stiles slipped into the hall without greeting anyone, the whispering pair of teenage girls who stopped abruptly when Miss Marple looked their way. "It's such a good turnout," said Mrs. Pennington, bustling past with an armful of crockery. "Almost the whole village. Except, of course, poor Mr. Harwood. He's taken ill again. Nerves, I expect." Miss Marple inclined her head kindly. "One does notice absences as much as presences, doesn't one?" she remarked. It was at precisely 11:15, while the raffle tickets were being drawn, that the disturbance occurred. A shriek split the air. High, startled, and unmistakably real. The crowd surged toward the back corner of the hall. There, behind the table stacked with books, the wooden floorboards had given a peculiar hollow sound. Someone, young Peter Larch, trying to retrieve a dropped coin, had tugged at a loose plank. Beneath it, in the darkness, something metallic glinted. When the plank was pulled aside completely, there lay a dagger, its blade darkened, the hilt ornate but smeared with old brownish stains. Gasps rippled through the hall. Someone whispered, "Blood." Someone else said sharply, "Don't touch it. Call the police." The dagger seemed to radiate a chill into the warm summer air. It looked very old, very dangerous, and very wrong lying there beneath the respectable boards of Marleycombe's parish hall. Miss Marple, standing slightly apart, clasped her hands gently together. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes rested on the dagger with deep attention. She, more than anyone, understood what such an object meant. The calm surface of Marleycombe had just been broken. Beneath lay secrets, dark, sharp, and waiting. And already, she suspected, gossip would spread faster than the police could arrive. Chapter 2. Whispers on the Green. By the time the constable had been summoned to the parish hall, the news had already begun to spread. Marleycombe had its own peculiar speed for such matters. A whisper in the post office in the morning could become a full-fledged scandal by tea time. And now, with the discovery of the dagger, the village seemed almost alive with murmurs. Outside the hall, villagers clustered in little knots, their voices low but urgent. Mrs. Larch, still pale after her son's discovery, declared that the dagger must surely be medieval, perhaps even Roman. Mr. Pritchard, the churchwarden, insisted it had been hidden there only recently. "The blade's too well preserved," he said with authority, though he had never seen such a weapon before in his life. Miss Marple emerged quietly, as she often did, unnoticed at first by the crowd. She paused on the steps, her hands resting lightly on the handle of her parasol. Around her, the conversations wove and twisted like tangled threads. "Buried treasure, that's what it is." "Don't be absurd, Gladys. No one buries treasure beneath a hall floorboard." "Well, if it's blood, someone's been murdered, that's certain." "Nonsense. It's probably theatrical. A stage prop left behind after one of the plays." "Stage prop? Don't be silly, there's dried blood on it. And beneath these voices ran something subtler, less easily defined, a current of unease. Marleycombe had never been a place for violence. The most shocking event in recent memory had been Mrs. Finch losing her cat for 3 days. But a dagger, stained in secret, suggested something altogether different. Something dreadful that had lain beneath their feet during countless cheerful dances and Christmas pageants. Miss Marple moved toward the green, where a few villagers had already settled on benches to exchange theories. She overheard snippets as she passed. Do you think it belonged to one of the Harwoods? Their grandfather was in India, wasn't he? I wouldn't put it past young Edgar Styles. Always keeps to himself, that one. Very queer. My cousin in Elmsworth said there was a burglary there last year with a knife involved. Miss Marple's eyes softened. She knew well how swiftly suspicion could take root, and how cruelly it might fall upon the innocent. People, in their eagerness for explanation, often reached for the most dramatic or the most convenient culprit. As she reached her neat little cottage on the lane, she found her neighbor, Mrs. Weatherby, already waiting at the gate. Miss Marple, Mrs. Weatherby cried, her cheeks flushed. You've heard, of course, about the weapon. I was present, Miss Marple said mildly. Oh, then you'll know better than anyone. Do you think it's connected to a murder? Oh, I shouldn't wonder. You remember poor Major Rawlings? Dropped dead so suddenly last year. Never properly explained, if you ask me. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Heart failure, dear. Mrs. Weatherby sniffed. So they said. But there's more to Marleycombe than meets the eye, I assure you. Skeletons in cupboards. Dreadful quarrels. Why, I wouldn't be surprised if half the village had a motive for hiding a weapon. Miss Marple made a small, soothing noise, and after Mrs. Weatherby had bustled off, she lingered a moment at her gate. The village lay bathed in golden light, as peaceful as ever. But beneath the surface, fear and gossip were already reshaping the familiar streets. And Miss Marple, with her gentle eyes and quiet patience, knew that somewhere among those whispers lay the first threads of truth. Chapter 3. Odd Looks and Loose Threads. The parish hall, by the next morning, had been cordoned off by the police. Constable Briggs, red-faced and somewhat flustered, had spent the previous afternoon attempting to take statements, though half of Marleycombe had tried to talk at once. By breakfast time, however, the matter was already being digested across the village in the form of rumor, speculation, and a great many knowing winks. At the King's Arms, the local inn, the discovery of the dagger had become the only subject worth discussing. Mark my words, declared Mr. Pritchard, pounding the table with his pipe. That weapon wasn't there long. Fresh as anything. I wouldn't be surprised if the culprit's one of us, sitting here this very moment. This caused Mrs. Dunstable to gasp and look suspiciously at her neighbor, who responded with a glare. Meanwhile, Miss Marple, having completed her morning routine with quiet efficiency, stepped out into the village once more. She made her way slowly down the lane, her eyes noting things others dismissed. A curtain twitched in the Harwood house, far too quickly drawn back. Edgar Styles crossed the road without greeting anyone, his head bent, his shoulders tense. Mrs. Pennington, usually the first to offer cheerful gossip, walked past with only a brief nod, her lips pressed tightly together. At the greengrocer's, Miss Marple lingered by the plums and listened unobtrusively to the low-voiced chatter. Constable says the blade's got age to it. Proper antique. Well, then why was it hidden there, eh? Someone wanted it out of sight. Between you and me, I heard they found a piece of cloth wrapped round the handle. Torn. Stained. Miss Marple selected her fruit, her face showing no more than polite interest, though the words stayed with her. A cloth. Torn. Stained. Such things often held more meaning than their finders realized. By midday, the sun shone fiercely on the green, where a few villagers gathered as though drawn by invisible strings. Miss Marple joined them on a bench, her knitting bag resting on her lap. She let the needles click softly while she listened. And Mrs. Larch looked fit to faint when it was uncovered. Too fit, if you ask me. Guilty conscience. Oh, nonsense. It's Harwood blood. Always a shadow over that family. You wait. Someone will be arrested before the week is out. Miss Marple smiled faintly at her knitting. People so often revealed more than they intended, not only in words but in the vehemence with which they spoke. And there, standing on the edge of the group, she noticed Edgar Styles again, hovering, listening, yet never contributing. His hands twitched at his sides, restless. When their eyes met briefly, he looked away at once. Too quickly. Too deliberately. Miss Marple's needles paused. It was not proof. Oh no, not nearly that. But it was something. A thread as fragile as a strand of wool, waiting to be tugged. She resumed her knitting, her face serene, her thoughts anything but. Chapter 4. The Wrong Man. Constable Briggs prided himself on being thorough, though few in Marleycombe would have called him subtle. By the second day, he had come to a conclusion he was eager to share. Edgar Styles, he announced with authority in the King's Arms that evening, is the man we're looking for. No doubt about it. Gasps and murmurs spread around the taproom. Mr. Styles had lived alone at the edge of the village since his return from service abroad. A thin, nervous man with darting eyes, he had never quite fitted in. He neither joined the cricket team nor attended the church fetes, and such aloofness in Marleycombe was enough to breed suspicion. Briggs leaned forward, lowering his voice though ensuring everyone could hear. I've it on good authority that his boots were seen near the hall yesterday morning. Mud on them, fresh. And there are stains on one of his shirts. Could be blood. That settles it then, muttered Mrs. Dunstable with a triumphant nod. I always said he was odd. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively in the corner with her knitting, lifted her eyes only briefly. She noted how eagerly the villagers received Briggs's theory, as though relieved to have a culprit handed to them, someone who fitted the role. Yet, as she well knew, eagerness was rarely the companion of truth. The next morning, Constable Briggs called at Styles's cottage. Edgar answered the door with a tremor in his hand, his face pale. The constable, accompanied by 2 assistants from the county police, searched the little rooms. There they found the shirt indeed, marked with a brown stain across the sleeve. It's paint, Edgar protested, his voice breaking. From the shed I was mending a chair. I swear it. But few believed him. Word spread swiftly. Edgar Styles had been questioned, and though not formally charged, most declared the case as good as solved. That afternoon, Miss Marple received a visit from Mrs. Weatherby, eyes bright with excitement. They'll have him before the magistrate by week's end, you'll see. And won't it be a relief? Why, I shan't feel safe until he's locked away. Miss Marple offered tea, her manner calm. One does hope, she murmured, that the truth is being pursued rather than convenience. Mrs. Weatherby blinked. Why, whatever do you mean? Miss Marple's eyes were mild, almost apologetic. Only that human beings are not always so simple. A stain may be paint, after all, just as a dagger may be older than its hiding place. One must look at the whole picture. Her neighbor huffed, unconvinced. But when Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her thoughts were far from tranquil. Edgar Styles was frightened, yes, but in his fear she had sensed confusion, not guilt. He had not looked like a man concealing a crime. He had looked rather like a man bewildered at being accused of one. And that, Miss Marple knew, was a very different thing. Chapter 5. Shadows of the Past. Though the constable remained fixed on Edgar Styles, the village itself began turning its gaze elsewhere. Gossip, once loosed, was a creature that could not be contained. It crept into cottages, shops, and parlors, carrying with it tales of old wrongs and private quarrels. At the post office, Mrs. Dunstable leaned across the counter and whispered loudly to anyone who would listen. The Harwoods, of course. Always something queer about that family. You know their grandfather made a fortune in India? Stories of cruelty, dreadful business. Wouldn't surprise me if that dagger was his. Meanwhile, at the baker's, Mrs. Pennington declared she had once seen Mr. Larch and Mr. Harwood quarreling over land boundaries near the stream. Raised voices, wild gestures. There was bad blood there. Very bad. Miss Marple, who had called in for a loaf, listened quietly. The details did not escape her. Land disputes, family legacies, quarrels whispered of but never forgotten. These were the sorts of things that left marks deeper than most people realized. Later that day, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Whitcomb, paid a visit to Miss Marple's cottage. She sat primly on the edge of the chair, her gloved hands folded, her eyes alight with the eagerness of someone about to share forbidden knowledge. "You will have heard," she began, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial murmur, "about the quarrel between Mrs. Pennington and her late husband. Quite violent, I'm told. And when he died so suddenly, well, some wondered." Miss Marple poured tea with her usual serenity. "I had thought it was pneumonia." Mrs. Whitcomb hesitated. "So it was said. But there are whispers, you know. Whispers that perhaps it was not entirely natural." The teacups clinked softly as Miss Marple set down the pot. She did not answer at once, for she knew well that behind every rumor lay a kernel of truth, or just as often, a kernel of malice. The art was in discerning which. That evening, walking back across the green, Miss Marple paused. From the Harwood house drifted the sound of raised voices, quickly muffled when the door shut. At the far end of the lane, Edgar Stiles hurried along, his figure tense against the fading light, as though pursued by unseen eyes. Marleycombe, so tranquil in appearance, was stirring with currents of distrust. Old resentments were resurfacing, and in every household, it seemed, there lay a shadow of something hidden. Miss Marple, her step unhurried, made her way home. She had no evidence yet, no chain of proof, but she felt the atmosphere thickening, the air charged with secrets long suppressed, and she knew that in such an atmosphere, violence was never far away. Chapter 6. Another blow. The village had scarcely settled into the rhythm of speculation when a fresh disturbance shattered Marleycombe's fragile calm. It was a Thursday evening, the air heavy with the scent of cut grass, when young Peter Larch came running across the green, his face white with terror. "They've found him," he cried. "Mr. Harwood at the Hall." Within moments, half the village had gathered once more at the parish hall, the place now notorious as the scene of the Dagger's discovery. Inside, beneath the dim light of the lamps, lay Mr. Harwood, motionless, sprawled across the very spot where the weapon had been uncovered. At first glance, some thought he had collapsed from natural causes, but Constable Briggs, sweating profusely, shook his head. "There's no mistake. Blow to the head. Murder right enough." A collective gasp rose, and the room filled with nervous murmurs. The discovery of the dagger had been sensational enough, but now there was a body, and with it the dreadful confirmation that Marleycombe's peace had been pierced in earnest. Mrs. Pennington clutched her shawl tightly. "I said so, didn't I? I said that dagger meant bloodshed." Briggs puffed out his chest. "We already have our man. Edgar Stiles. This proves it beyond doubt." But Miss Marple, standing a little apart, studied the scene with quiet intensity. Her eyes lingered not only on the body but on the faces gathered around it. Mrs. Larch, pale and trembling. Peter, staring wide-eyed. Mrs. Dunstable whispering furiously into her neighbor's ear. And there, at the edge of the group, Edgar Stiles himself, drawn as if by morbid fascination, his features stricken with horror. If Edgar had indeed committed this act, Miss Marple thought, then his performance was extraordinary. For the man looked less like a killer than a moth caught helplessly in a flame. As the police ushered people back, Miss Marple's attention flicked to something small and easily overlooked. A fragment of fabric caught on the splintered floorboard near Harwood's body. Pale in color, almost ivory. Torn hastily as though in struggle. Most would miss it. But Miss Marple's eyes, sharpened by years of knitting and sharper still by decades of watching human frailty, did not. And as she left the hall, the air buzzing with fear and accusation, she carried with her a quiet certainty. The murder of Mr. Harwood was no simple crime of passion. It was a piece of something larger. Threads woven into a tapestry of secrets that only the patient would unravel. Chapter 7. Patterns in the Quiet. Marleycombe awoke the morning after Mr. Harwood's death in a state of unease. Curtains twitched, doors were kept firmly shut, and the usual cheerful bustle of the high street was subdued. People spoke in lowered voices, glancing over their shoulders as though danger lurked in every shadow. At the post office, the gossip was relentless. "They say his head was struck with something blunt. Perhaps the dagger itself." No, no, that was hidden away. Mark my words, the killer had another weapon. Well, whoever it wasn't a stranger. You don't get strangers creeping into parish halls at night. Miss Marple, waiting patiently to post a letter, listened with polite interest. She made no comment, though her eyes sharpened when Mrs. Dunstable mentioned seeing Mrs. Larch near the hall, far too late in the evening, if you ask me. Later, seated in her garden with her knitting, Miss Marple allowed her mind to turn over the fragments of what she had observed. The dagger beneath the floorboards, hidden deliberately. The cloth wrapped about its hilt, now vanished. The pale scrap of fabric she had seen by Harwood's body. The intensity with which suspicion had fastened itself upon Edgar Styles. And, perhaps most curious of all, the quarrels whispered about between Harwood and half the village. Quarrels over land, over money, over matters long past but never forgotten. Miss Marple reflected, with the gentle patience of her years, that murder rarely sprang from nothing. It came, like weeds, from soil that had been long prepared. That afternoon she ventured onto the green, where a few villagers lingered in uneasy groups. Edgar Styles was there, hunched on a bench, his hands clenched tightly together. He looked up as Miss Marple approached, his eyes wide with desperation. "They'll hang this on me, Miss Marple," he whispered hoarsely. "I swear I had nothing to do with it, but they'll see what they want to see. Please, you must believe me." Miss Marple sat beside him, her manner calm and kind. "The truth, Mr. Styles," she said softly, "has a way of making itself known, even when men would prefer otherwise. One only needs to be patient." He buried his face in his hands, trembling. When she left him, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to Mrs. Larch across the green, her eyes red-rimmed, her voice too shrill in its insistence that she knew nothing at all. And near the church, Mrs. Pennington spoke in hushed tones with Mr. Pritchard, both glancing nervously toward the Harwood house. The village was alive with fear, but beneath the fear Miss Marple saw something else. Patterns. A tightening web of connections, resentments, and lies. Her needles clicked steadily when she returned home, but her thoughts were sharper than steel. The threads were gathering, and she would follow them, quietly, patiently, until the whole cloth of truth was revealed. Chapter 8. Secrets in the Air. By Sunday, Marleycombe was humming with unease. The church pews were fuller than usual, though the air was thick with something less holy than devotion. People came not so much to pray as to watch one another, to whisper behind him books, to weigh guilt and innocence in sidelong glances. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her usual place, observed as she always did. Mrs. Larch avoided everyone's eyes, her lips moving in prayers that seemed more desperate than devout. Mrs. Pennington, resplendent in a new hat, looked about her with a certain self-satisfaction, as though being part of such a scandal somehow elevated her importance. Edgar Styles, pale and hunched, slipped in late and left before the final hymn. After the service, the vicar's wife could not resist pressing close to Miss Marple, her voice lowered but urgent. "You must have heard," she whispered, "about Mrs. Pennington and Mr. Harwood. A friendship, shall we say, not entirely proper. It was years ago, of course, but some say it never quite ended." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained kind. "How very interesting. Though one must remember, dear, that people are sometimes more inclined to imagine impropriety than to truly observe it." Yet, as she walked home, she considered it carefully. Affairs, real or rumored, left marks on reputations, and such marks could fester into motives. That afternoon, another whisper reached her cottage door, this time from young Elsie, the maid at the inn, who carried a basket of eggs. "Beg pardon, Miss Marple, but I thought you should know. I heard Mr. Pritchard and Mr. Harwood had terrible words, just before it happened. Over money, I think. Something to do with the church funds." Miss Marple accepted the eggs with gratitude, her mind noting the detail. Quarrels about money were rarely insignificant. By evening, yet another thread emerged. Mrs. Weatherby arrived, flushed with importance. "They'll never tell you this openly," she began, "but the Harwoods were nearly ruined 10 years ago. Investments, bad debts. I dare say enemies were made then. Enemies who might not forget." Miss Marple poured tea, listening in silence. When Mrs. Weatherby departed, The little sitting room seemed unusually still. Outside, Marleycomb's evening lay soft and golden, but within, Miss Marple's thoughts moved in quiet, deliberate patterns. Affairs whispered of, financial disputes, rivalries over land and legacy. So many possible motives, each one hidden beneath the polite veneer of village life. She folded her knitting carefully. Secrets were surfacing now, drawn out by the shadow of the dagger and the weight of Harwood's death. And Miss Marple knew from long experience that once secrets began to emerge, they seldom stopped until the whole truth lay bare. Chapter 9. The First Cracks. Monday brought with it a deceptive calm. The shops opened as usual, children skipped along the lanes, and the baker set out his trays of warm loaves. Yet beneath the rhythm of village life there was a tautness, like a violin string pulled too tight. At the greengrocer's, Miss Marple stood quietly among the cabbages and carrots, listening. Mrs. Dunstable was in fine form, holding forth on what she had heard directly from Constable Briggs. They say Harwood was struck at 9 o'clock sharp. Oh yes, Briggs is quite sure. Which means Edgar Styles could easily have done it. He was seen skulking about the green at just that time. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression mild. "That is curious," she said softly. "For I recall Mrs. Larch mentioning only yesterday that she saw Mr. Styles passing her gate well after 10. Quite certain she was, as the clock had just struck." Mrs. Dunstable blinked, thrown off for a moment. Well, perhaps she was mistaken. Miss Marple offered a faint smile, as if in agreement, but inwardly she noted the discrepancy. Time, she knew, was often the first casualty in the telling of lies. Later that day, she took a quiet walk by the stream. There she encountered Mr. Pritchard, who greeted her with stiff politeness. In the course of their conversation, he remarked, "Terrible business. And to think I was with Harwood that very afternoon." Perfectly well he seemed then, though a trifle irritable as ever. Miss Marple's eyes softened. "How fortunate, then, that you were spared the unpleasantness later that evening." "Indeed," said Pritchard. But he avoided her gaze. And Miss Marple, who had already heard from Elsie that Pritchard and Harwood had argued heatedly the night before the murder, noted the subtle evasion. A man who minimized quarrels was often a man with something to hide. That evening, at her cottage, Miss Marple spread her knitting across her lap but scarcely moved the needles. Instead, she let her thoughts weave together the threads she had gathered. Edgar Styles placed at 2 different times in 2 different accounts. Mr. Pritchard concealing the severity of his quarrel. Mrs. Pennington's eagerness to speak of impropriety, yet her own name surfacing in whispers of scandal. Each contradiction was small, but Miss Marple had long since learned that truth, like a well-made garment, was seamless. Lies, however, always left untidy stitches. And in Marleycomb, those untidy stitches were beginning to show. Chapter 10. Cruel Tongues. By midweek, Marleycomb's tranquility had soured. Suspicion, once a whisper, had become an accusation in all but name. People crossed the street rather than greet one another. Conversations stopped abruptly when certain figures approached. The village had split itself into little camps, each with its own theory, its own favored culprit. Edgar Styles bore the brunt of it. At the inn, when he entered for his supper, a hush fell. 2 men at the bar muttered loud enough for all to hear. "Best not sit too near. You never know what he's hiding in his coat." Laughter followed, cruel and thin. Edgar turned pale, his hand tightening on his cap, before retreating without ordering a thing. Miss Marple, who had been quietly sipping her tea in the corner, watched the scene with eyes that missed nothing. She noted not only Edgar's misery but the eagerness with which the villagers turned it into entertainment. Gossip, she reflected, had teeth. Later, on her walk home, she paused by the Harwood house. It stood shuttered and silent, the windows dark though the evening was mild. Something fluttered faintly against the gatepost, a scrap of paper caught by the wind. Miss Marple bent delicately and retrieved it. The fragment bore a few hurried words in pencil, smudged but still legible. "Must not be found, Floorboards, tonight." Miss Marple folded the scrap neatly and slipped it into her pocket. It might be nothing. It might be everything. At her cottage, she examined it again by lamplight. The writing was rushed, the lines jagged, as though written in haste or fear. And the reference to floorboards was too pointed to ignore. The dagger had been hidden beneath them. What else, she wondered, might lie beneath Marleycomb's polished surfaces? That night, the village seemed unnaturally quiet, every shutter drawn, every lamp extinguished early. Yet Miss Marple sat long awake, her knitting idle in her lap, the fragment of paper beside her. Cruel tongues had driven suspicion toward Edgar Styles, but this clue suggested another hand entirely. Someone who feared discovery. Someone still desperate to keep their secret buried. And Miss Marple, gazing out into the darkened lane, felt certain the game in Marleycomb was only beginning. Chapter 11. Testing the Waters. Constable Briggs was more certain than ever. By Thursday morning, he was striding about the village with the air of a man on the brink of triumph. Evidence, that's what counts, he declared loudly outside the post office. And we've evidence aplenty against Edgar Styles. His boots, his shirt, his behavior. Why, it's practically a confession. Several villagers nodded eagerly, relieved to have their suspicions confirmed. To them, Edgar's nervous manner and solitary habits were proof enough. Miss Marple, standing nearby with her basket, merely inclined her head. She had heard such certainty before, and it rarely ended where one expected. That afternoon she decided, in her quiet way, to make an experiment. She paid a call on Mrs. Larch, bringing a jar of raspberry preserve as an excuse. The woman received her with fluttering hands and red-rimmed eyes. Oh, Miss Marple, what a dreadful business. To think it happened right there at the hall. My Peter still has nightmares. Miss Marple poured sympathy with gentle words, then let her eyes drift about the sitting room. On the arm of a chair lay a sewing basket. Beside it, a square of pale ivory fabric, torn at the edge. She reached out, touching it lightly. Such lovely material. A curtain. Mrs. Larch flushed. An old slip, nothing worth keeping. I was cutting it into rags. Her voice was too quick, her manner too defensive. Miss Marple made no comment, but tucked the observation away carefully. The following morning, Miss Marple set out toward the church, where she found Mr. Pritchard arranging him books with more force than was strictly necessary. So tragic about Harwood, Miss Marple said mildly. And after you saw him only the afternoon before, looking so well. Pritchard froze, his hands tightening on the books. Who told you that? You did, dear, Miss Marple replied with her gentle smile. Only a day or two ago. He muttered something about confusion, then turned hastily away. When she returned home, Miss Marple sat by her window with her knitting. The threads of her suspicions were gathering. The torn ivory fabric, the evasions, the contradictions. She had no proof yet, but proof, she reflected, often arrived late in the day. Human behavior, however, declared itself much sooner. Meanwhile, across the village, Constable Briggs was loudly assuring Mrs. Dunstable that Edgar Styles would surely hang for it. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. She was not so certain. And she had learned, long ago, that when men spoke with too much confidence, it was often because they feared to look too closely at what they might find. Chapter 12. Poison in the Air. By Friday, Marleycomb was choking on its own gossip. It lingered in the shops, slithered through the lanes, and drifted over tea tables like smoke from a damp fire. Every villager seemed eager not just to whisper but to wound. Mrs. Dunstable, never one to miss an opportunity, confided in Mrs. Pennington that Edgar Styles had been caught peering into windows after dark. And we all know what sort of man does that, she said with relish. By the next morning, the tale had grown teeth. Edgar had not only been peering, he had been lurking, then prowling, then, before long, committing unspeakable acts in the imagination of the villagers. Miss Marple listened with quiet patience, but inwardly she winced. Rumor, she knew, was far more dangerous than truth. It turned suspicion into certainty, and certainty into cruelty. That afternoon, she attended the churchyard, ostensibly to tend a neglected grave. As she trimmed ivy from the stone, she noticed something glinting faintly near the path. A button. Not just any button, but a small, pearl-colored one, finely made, the sort used on ladies' evening gowns. Miss Marple bent to examine it. The thread still clung to its back, torn rather than worn. She turned it over gently in her fingers, then slipped it into her pocket. Later, over tea, she thought of Mrs. Larch's sewing basket, with its square of pale ivory fabric hastily explained away. A slip, she had claimed, but the material had seemed heavier, richer, more suited to formal attire. And now here lay a button, delicate and expensive, torn from something worn the night of the murder. Miss Marple gazed into her teacup, her expression mild. The village might chatter itself hoarse about Edgar Styles, but she felt the faintest tug of the truth pointing elsewhere. Someone had been near the hall, wearing a gown meant for better occasions, and had left a fragment of themselves behind. That evening, as darkness drew in, the air in Marleycombe seemed charged, expectant. Villagers locked their doors earlier than usual, muttering about keeping safe. But Miss Marple, seated calmly by her window, let her needles click while her thoughts spun faster than the wool in her lap. The poison in the air was not only rumor, it was fear. And fear, she knew, had a way of making the guilty careless. Chapter 13. Threads of a Gown. Saturday brought the annual harvest fair, long planned and reluctantly kept despite the shadow of murder. The vicar, determined that evil must not steal our traditions, insisted it go ahead. So the green was strung with bunting, the stalls laid out, though laughter rang thinner than in years past. Miss Marple arrived quietly, basket on her arm, her eyes as sharp as her manner was mild. She knew well that in such gatherings, truth slipped more easily than at any formal questioning. People gossiped more freely when they believed themselves safe among neighbors. Mrs. Larch was there, bustling at the cake stall. She wore a plain brown frock, respectable if dull. But Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the faint mark along the seam of her sleeve, a pale thread, ivory in color, clinging stubbornly. The memory of the torn fabric in her sewing basket, and the pearl button in Miss Marple's pocket, pressed upon her mind. She said nothing yet. At the raffle table, Edgar Styles hovered uncertainly, drawing disapproving stares. A child muttered something cruel. His mother hushed him but did not hide her scorn. Edgar fled soon after, his isolation complete. The crowd's relief at his departure was almost palpable. Miss Marple, knitting needles tucked neatly in her basket, listened more than she spoke. She heard Mrs. Pennington tell the vicar's wife that Mr. Pritchard had been seen slipping into the Harwood garden late at night. She caught Mr. Dunstable boasting that he had more than once warned Harwood about his debts. And she observed Mrs. Larch, who kept glancing nervously toward the churchyard path as though expecting someone, or dreading them. In the late afternoon, as the fair wound down, a sudden commotion broke out near the green. A boy had found something beneath the boards of the Punch and Judy stage, a strip of torn cloth stained faintly, stuffed between the planks. The adults gathered, whispering darkly. Constable Briggs seized it, declaring it yet another proof of Edgar Styles's guilt. But Miss Marple, standing a little apart, recognized the weave of the cloth. Heavy, expensive, evening wear, the same kind as the button. Her heart stirred. Threads were drawing together, delicate but certain. As the villagers dispersed in nervous knots, Miss Marple walked slowly home, the autumn air sharp on her cheeks. She knew now that the truth was stitched not in Edgar's shabby clothes, but in finery. And finery, in a village like Marleycombe, was always worn for a reason. That night, she placed the pearl button and the scrap of cloth side by side on her table. They belonged to the same garment, she felt sure. A garment worn the night Harwood died. The gown itself, and the woman who had worn it, would not remain hidden forever. Chapter 14. Uneasy Shadows. Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear, the bells of St. Michael's ringing across the valley. The villagers gathered for service, their faces pious, their whispers anything but. It was as though Marleycombe sought absolution while at the same time clutching tightly to its secrets. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her pew, observed the little dramas unfolding. Mrs. Pennington ostentatiously avoided sitting near Mrs. Larch. Mr. Pritchard fumbled his hymn book with uncharacteristic clumsiness, and Edgar Styles, pale and miserable, slipped in at the last moment, choosing a seat at the very back. Afterwards, outside the church, Miss Marple lingered. She greeted villagers with her usual courtesy, but her ears were keenly tuned. She caught Mrs. Dunstable hissing to Mrs. Pennington, "She'll never admit it, but everyone knows Mrs. Larch was far too friendly with Harwood. That's why her husband left her, mark my words." Mrs. Pennington gave a sharp laugh. "Better her than you, dear. Your name's been linked with his often enough." The smile froze on Mrs. Dunstable's lips. For a moment the mask slipped, and Miss Marple saw something raw, resentment, perhaps even fear. Rivals, she thought. Not for affection but for advantage. Harwood had been a man of influence in his petty way, and influence in a small village was currency indeed. Later that day, Miss Marple made her way to the rectory garden, ostensibly to admire the dahlias. There she encountered Mr. Pritchard again, pacing in agitation. "Such gossip," he burst out when she remarked on the fine weather. "It's poisoning everything. And that poor Styles, ruined by wagging tongues. Yet what else can one expect? Harwood always brought trouble." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "And you knew him well, did you not?" Pritchard started. "Hardly. Barely spoke to the man." But Miss Marple remembered too clearly his earlier admission of seeing Harwood the very afternoon before his death. He was rewriting his part in events, trimming his words to safety. Such trimming, she knew, was often more dangerous than a blunt admission. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her lamp, her knitting needles moving but her mind far away. She thought of the torn fabric, the pearl button, the stained scrap at the fair. She thought of rivalries hidden behind polite smiles, of women who resented one another, of men who feared exposure. And she thought, too, of the subtle unease she had begun to notice in certain quarters. A glance too sharp, a denial too quick, a hand that trembled when no one was meant to see. The killer, she felt sure, was beginning to sense her quiet watchfulness. And guilt, like ivy, had a way of pushing through cracks, no matter how firmly one tried to wall it in. Chapter 15. The Stranger's Tale. Monday brought with it a visitor, the sort of presence that never failed to stir Marleycombe into renewed speculation. A motor car, rare enough in the village, pulled up outside the inn, and from it stepped a stranger in a neat traveling coat, carrying a leather case. Within an hour, it was known to everyone that he was Mr. Lionel Graves, a solicitor from Exeter. By lunchtime, it was also known, thanks to Mrs. Dunstable, that he had been handling certain business matters for the late Mr. Harwood. Miss Marple, knitting on the green, heard the rest soon enough. Graves had called on the constable, then paid a discreet visit to the Harwood house. By mid-afternoon, he took a turn about the village, where Miss Marple happened upon him. He greeted her politely, though with the guarded air of a man conscious of carrying delicate information. "You were a friend of Mr. Harwood's?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Not precisely," Graves replied. "I represented certain interests of his. He was, less prudent than he might have been. Debts, entanglements. He had lately pressed me to draft changes to his will. Abrupt changes." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "He intended to cut off one beneficiary entirely. He did not say whom, only that they had disappointed him gravely. The document was not yet signed when he died." Graves hesitated, then added, "I should also say he mentioned a keepsake. Something hidden should the worst befall him. A safeguard of sorts." Miss Marple's eyes softened with interest, though her voice remained mild. "Hidden. Beneath floorboards, perhaps." Graves looked startled. "Why, yes. How did you—" But Miss Marple only smiled, as if she had said something absent-mindedly. When the solicitor took his leave, the village hummed with new excitement. A will, a hidden keepsake, a cut-off heir. Every conversation bristled with speculation. Some swore it was Edgar Styles who had been disinherited. Others muttered darkly about Mrs. Pennington. That evening, Miss Marple sat with the pearl button before her, the solicitor's words echoing in her mind. A will changed in anger, a keepsake hidden beneath floorboards, and someone desperate enough to silence Harwood before he could speak further. The pieces were shifting closer. But she also felt the weight of danger. A murderer who killed once to keep a secret might kill again if cornered. As the clock struck 9, Miss Marple laid aside her knitting and went to draw the curtains. Across the lane, a figure lingered briefly at the corner, watching her cottage, before slipping away into the shadows. Miss Marple stood very still. The game, it seemed, was moving nearer to her own doorstep. Chapter 16. The Trap and the Shock. Tuesday dawned bright, yet the air in Marleycombe was heavy, as though the very village sensed a storm approaching. Miss Marple, however, seemed her usual gentle self as she went about small errands. Only she knew that her day had been planned with deliberate care. At the grocer's, in a voice pitched just loud enough to carry, she remarked to Mrs. Dunstable, "Such a curious thing Mr. Graves said about Harwood hiding something beneath the floorboards. I dare say the constable will be lifting half the village floors by now." She continued serenely on her way, pausing later at the post office, where she told Mr. Pritchard she had heard the hidden item was a letter, most compromising to someone still among us. And finally, at the churchyard, she allowed Mrs. Larch to overhear her say to the vicar's wife, "It seems the solicitor believes Harwood left proof of betrayal. Why, whoever it touches must be trembling." By the end of the day, the whispers had multiplied, spreading faster than ivy across a wall. Some dismissed her words as nonsense. Others carried them in fear to their neighbors. But Miss Marple had not spoken idly. She watched carefully, noting whose color rose, whose hand trembled, whose lips grew too quick to deny. That evening, as she sat knitting by her lamp, the village was suddenly shaken by a cry. A boy came racing down the lane, white-faced, shouting that something dreadful had happened at the inn. Miss Marple set down her needles and went at once. A small crowd had already gathered outside. Inside, upon the stair, Edgar Styles was slumped against the wall, bleeding from a gash on his forehead. "He fell," someone exclaimed. "Slipped, that's all." But Edgar, clutching at the banister, whispered hoarsely, "No, pushed. Someone pushed me." His eyes darted wildly toward the shadows at the far end of the passage, though no one was there now. Constable Briggs barked orders, insisting Edgar had tripped in his drink. Yet Miss Marple, standing quietly apart, saw the fear etched in Edgar's face. She believed him. Someone had tried to silence him, or frighten him into silence. The room was abuzz, suspicion turning yet again. Some said Edgar had staged it for pity. Others murmured darkly that the murderer was striking a second time. Miss Marple, however, thought differently. This was not another murder. It was a warning. A sign that the real culprit, unnerved by her whispers of a hidden proof, had lashed out. And in doing so, they had betrayed their own desperation. She folded her hands serenely. The trap had been laid. And someone, in their panic, had already stumbled into it. Chapter 17. Closing the Circle. The morning after Edgar's fall, the village buzzed like a disturbed hive. Some declared him a drunkard who had stumbled. Others whispered darkly that the murderer had struck again. But behind the clamor lay unease, like the hush before thunder. Miss Marple, sitting in the vicarage garden with her knitting, considered the matter carefully. Her trap had worked. The whisper of hidden proof had driven someone to act. But who? She laid out the threads as neatly as stitches on her needles. Mrs. Larch, with her torn fabric and evasive answers, a woman who had more connection to Harwood than she admitted. Mr. Pritchard, whose story shifted like sand, who sought to erase his quarrel with the dead man. Mrs. Dunstable, rival and gossip, with more venom in her tongue than most kept in their hearts. Mrs. Pennington, whose name had surfaced too often in murmurs of impropriety. And always, poor Edgar Styles, the convenient scapegoat. His very awkwardness had made him an easy target for suspicion. But Miss Marple knew awkwardness was not the same as guilt. That afternoon, she paid a quiet call on Mrs. Larch. She brought plum jam, an offering so ordinary it could not arouse suspicion. As they sipped tea, Miss Marple's eyes fell, apparently by chance, on the sewing basket once more. "My dear," she said gently, "I've always admired women who can mend so neatly. A lost button can tell such a story, don't you think?" Mrs. Larch's hand trembled as she lifted her cup. "Buttons? I've not lost any." Miss Marple only smiled, her needles clicking softly in her lap. She had not accused, she had merely planted another seed. That evening, the constable made a loud show of declaring Edgar Styles the chief suspect, though he admitted under pressure he had no new evidence. The villagers muttered, some relieved, others skeptical. Miss Marple, walking home beneath the fading light, felt a weight in the air. The killer, she thought, had grown desperate. And desperation was dangerous. If whispers of hidden proof had unsettled them, the next step might drive them to something rash, something bold. As she turned the corner to her lane, she paused. Her cottage curtains had been drawn when she left, but now one hung slightly askew, as if disturbed. Inside, the room was as she had left it, except for one thing. On the table where she had kept the pearl button and the scrap of cloth, there was only empty wood. Miss Marple stood very still. The killer was not only desperate now. They were watching her. Chapter 18. Shadows of the Past. The theft was a message, Miss Marple knew, not an act of gain. Whoever had slipped into her cottage had not wanted the pearl button and the cloth for their worth, but for their danger. Evidence, however slight, had made them bold enough to risk entering her home. Miss Marple, when she mentioned it at the vicarage, described the matter as lightly as if she had mislaid her spectacles. "I'm forever putting things down and forgetting them," she told the vicar's wife with a gentle smile. Yet her eyes, when turned away, were sharper than ever. That afternoon, she sat in the churchyard with her knitting. One by one, villagers passed by, offering condolences about Edgar Stiles, or muttering about Harwood's will, or lowering their voices when Mrs. Larch came into sight. Miss Marple listened, nodded, and stored away each phrase as neatly as she stored her wool. It was Mr. Pritchard who gave her the key she needed, though he never intended to. He was speaking too loudly, as usual, about the unfairness of life, when he declared bitterly, "Harwood always thought himself above us, holding that debt over me as though I'd ever truly owed him. It was his way to remind you of your shame." Miss Marple's needles stilled. A debt. Not only money, she suspected. Harwood had thrived on secrets, on little holdfasts of power over others. And when men or women feared exposure, they could be driven to desperate measures. That evening, she took a slow walk to the stream, recalling old patterns of behavior she had observed in St. Mary Mead, and in countless human dramas besides. Those who felt cornered often revealed themselves not by what they said, but by how they responded to fear. By the time she returned home, her mind was quietly resolved. A test was needed, not of evidence, but of nerves. If she could let it be believed that Harwood's hidden keepsake had been found, then the guilty one, pressed by panic, might betray themselves. She poured her tea calmly, her face serene in the lamplight. Outside, the wind rattled the hedges, and somewhere in the dark a dog barked twice, sharply. Yes, it was nearly time. The truth would not be dragged into the open by force, but coaxed out by fear. And no one understood the language of fear and guilt better than Miss Marple. Chapter 19. The Net Tightens. By Wednesday, the village was humming with a new rumor. Word had it, no one could say exactly from whom, that Harwood's hidden keepsake had been discovered at last. Some whispered it was a letter, others insisted it was money, but all agreed it contained proof against someone still living in Marleycombe. Miss Marple, sipping tea with Mrs. Pennington, let the speculation swirl unchecked. She did not correct, did not deny. She only murmured, "Well, if such a thing were true, the guilty party must be in quite a state of mind." And indeed, she soon saw the results. Mr. Pritchard grew restless, pacing the lanes with quick, uneven steps, as though hunted by invisible pursuers. Mrs. Dunstable turned shrill, snapping at neighbors, her laugh too high, too brittle. But it was Mrs. Larch whose composure frayed most visibly. At the post office, when someone mentioned the word keepsake, her teacup rattled so violently in its saucer that the liquid spilled. Miss Marple noted it all, her expression mild, her eyes soft. That evening, she invited the vicar and his wife to her cottage. The gathering was entirely ordinary. Seed cake, hot tea, gentle conversation. But she allowed Mrs. Larch, passing by, to glimpse through the window a folded envelope lying conspicuously on her table. She knew it would be reported within the hour that Miss Marple herself had received a certain letter. And so it was. By morning, the village buzzed anew. Miss Marple's name was on every tongue, and the guilty one, whoever they were, would know their time was short. Late that night, Miss Marple sat knitting in her parlor, the letter still upon the table. She had written nothing inside, only a blank sheet folded over. Yet her trap did not depend on words. It depended on fear. The lane outside was silent. Then, faintly, she heard it, the crunch of a footstep, hesitant, pausing, then drawing nearer. The curtain stirred as though touched from without. Miss Marple did not move. Her needles clicked softly, calmly, as though she were deaf to the world. But inside, her mind was very alert. The net was tightening. And soon, she knew, the guilty one would reveal themselves, because fear, once roused, could not be contained forever. Chapter 20. The Trap Springs. The clock on Miss Marple's mantel struck 11, each chime echoing in the stillness of her little parlor. She sat by the lamplight, her knitting steady, the envelope lying innocently upon the table beside her. The footsteps outside returned, this time bolder, quicker. The latch of her gate clicked, and a shadow crossed the garden path. Miss Marple kept her eyes upon her needles, her face serene. Then came the sound, the faint scrape of a hand against the window frame. The curtain stirred once more. Miss Marple rose slowly, as if merely to pour herself more tea. She did not look toward the window. Instead, she hummed softly, an old hymn, as though she were a woman with nothing on her mind but wool and teacups. There was a sudden knock, sharp, insistent, at her door. She answered at once, her expression kindly. On the step stood Mrs. Larch, her shawl hastily thrown about her shoulders, her face pale in the lamplight. "Oh, Miss Marple," she cried breathlessly. I saw a figure lurking near your window. I came to warn you." Miss Marple regarded her with mild surprise. "How thoughtful of you, dear. Do come in. Perhaps you should sit. You seem rather shaken." But as Mrs. Larch crossed the threshold, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the faintest detail, a smear of fresh earth upon her glove, and the unmistakable bulge of something heavy hidden in her pocket. They sat. Miss Marple poured tea, her hands unhurried. Mrs. Larch's eyes flicked constantly to the envelope on the table, her breath uneven. At last she burst out, "That letter, you should burn it, Miss Marple. It can only bring trouble. Nothing good comes of digging up the past." Miss Marple tilted her head gently. "Oh, but the past always comes back, my dear, whether we invite it or not. It has a way of slipping beneath the floorboards, until someone lifts the rug." Mrs. Larch's teacup rattled violently against its saucer. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. In the silence, the church clock began to strike midnight. And in that heavy echoing moment, Miss Marple knew, the killer's mask was cracking. One more push, one more subtle prod, and the truth would spill forth.